Hello, everybody. This is our warm-up video for our class on Lamentations happening in just a few days on Monday, December 13th. The tone of this class is going to be a little bit different. The themes are tough. They're tough. And yet they are really some of the most important ideas for us to wrestle with if we want to take Judaism and Jewish tradition seriously. I know for myself as a feminist and the themes that we've been exploring together, it wasn't until I really got down to this particular root that we're going to wrap our hands around in class on Monday that I was able to see Judaism really clearly and make my peace with it. So interestingly, you can tell from the emails that I've started to get excited about what I hope is going to be our next series together. And this warm-up video is actually a great warm-up video for that series too. Because if that series is about uncovering the hidden goddess, this warm-up video today is where we see, first of all, the strongest evidence of her, but the evidence that we have of her is in the backlash to her. All right, so let's get into some of the details. I want to leave the theme that we're going to be wrestling with as we meet the Megillah, known as the Book of Lamentations, which is traditionally read on Tu B'Shvat. The theme we're going to be wrestling with there is Israel as adulterous wife, or really in the Bible's language, Israel as whoring woman. It's tough. And I want to I don't want to deal with the theme in the warm-up video. I want to leave that for the substance of class. Instead, in this video, I want to just put in some context, the biblical books that we're going to need to touch on in order to wrestle with this theme. And so to do that, I'm going to share my screen. And what you're going to see here now is these are the tables of contents from your JPS Tanakh. I hope by now you are all proud owners of a JPS Tanakh. And so you can see here, there's 36 books of the Tanakh laid out in front of you. And in order to get into these themes, we are going to, of course, read excerpts from the Book of Lamentations, of course. But then I'm also going to introduce you. We're going to take a taste of 4 other books of the prophets. So you can see here that we have laid out Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, 5 books of Moses, the collection of the middle section of Tanakh, which is called the prophets, and then Ketuvim, the section called writings. Our Megillot are from the writings. There is, though, and this is the key message of this warm-up video, there's a reversal that we have to do in our minds, that it's a little bit of mental gymnastics that really runs contrary to everything you got in Hebrew school, the basic orientation that you're invited into if you ever walk into a synagogue. If anyone ever hands you this book, the Tanakh, and says, here, we Jews, we're the people of the book, this is our book, and here is its basic story. The basic narrative that we hold Tanakh in our minds is that the Jewish story begins with Abraham and terminates with us and our descendants, and we continue to pass down the Torah. And that when we're talking about written text, that the Torah is the oldest, and then what comes at the end of the book here, what you see here is Divrei Hayamim, Chronicles, is the most recent. That's how we are meant to engage Tanakh, looking at this table of contents almost as like a timeline. However, when we get into the nitty-gritty of Tanakh, even reading the commentaries on the Torah, one of the most important things that both Rashi and Ramban, the two most important commentators on the 5 books of Moses, one of the very first things they tell us, and also Ibn Ezra, all the biggies, what they tell us is they have this quote, Ein mukdam u'muchar b'Torah. There is no chronological timeline in the Torah. They want you to know that the Torah and the Tanakh in general is a document that is not meant to, it's not history. It is not being offered to us as a timeline, a linear timeline, even when it looks like it is. This instinct to relate to the books in chronological order comes from much later in Jewish history. If we're looking at this table of contents as a timeline, it comes from way down here in this instinct of Ezra and Nehemiah, the latest layer. They're the ones who arrange the Tanakh into a singular book, and they lay it out in this sort of chronological order, but really it's a narrative chronology based on the sacred myth that is Judaism, the chronology that they want you to receive this book in. The chronology is part of the story. It's not part of history. It's part of story. It's part of sacred myth. And they give us this idea that we should relate to the Tanakh in chronological order. Why am I telling you all this? Because when we lay out Jewish history from a historical perspective, not from the perspectives of sacred myth, what we find is that for a great long while, we, the Jews, we were the people of story, but not the people of the book. And this tracks with the history of ideas in human cultures and when peoples started writing things down. Judaism, especially ancient biblical religion, ancient biblical Israelite religion, is older than the human instinct to write story down and to create history. Our people is older than that. And so what we find, I like to use King David because we have so much archaeology around David himself. I like to use King David as my actual historical anchor because King David is the first figure. And if we're looking at this as a timeline, we read about David in the books of Samuel here. So laid out in this timeline is sort of early Nevi'im. King David is the first historical Jewish figure that we can actually dig down into the earth and find, yes, he lived. We know when, we have evidence of it. Now, did the Jews who lived under the Davidic reign, did they have a book on their bookshelf called Tanakh? Absolutely not. Did they have a book on their bookshelf called Torah? Very unlikely. And the reason we know that that's very unlikely is that if we just keep reading in the history of that, if you just keep reading through these books of prophets, what you find is very, very, very different images of what it meant to be Jewish during back then. So first of all, what you find, you just have to open the book of Judges to discover that the people who lived during the time after Joshua, we have the narrative of the Torah, Moses' leadership gives way to Joshua's leadership. Those people conquer the land, they move in, they make Israel their home. Those people had a very, 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 very different definition of what it meant to be Jewish, what it meant to be in relationship with God than we do. So, and as you keep reading, what you find is that there's this evolving sense. We tend to put this bow tie on it and call it biblical Israelite religion, but it's more complicated than that. So we know, for example, from the book of Jeremiah, they kept Shabbat back then. Certainly, we know that the temple was a central point of focus, that there was no such thing as the Siddur, that prayer was not really something that was done, right? So we know all these basic differences, but when you really, really dig into the history, what you find is that the story, if you just allow it to be in each historical time period, is quite different than the sacred myth that is presented to you in Hebrew school or in this chronology of these books. All right, so this is all a very, very long warm-up. So why am I telling you all this? Because this basic metaphor that we're going to wrestle with through the book of Lamentations, Israel as whoring woman, it comes from the actual oldest layers of biblical Israelite religion. And what we're going to see in class is that it's really baked in there. So in the course of our class, I'm going to introduce you to 4 prophets, Hoshea, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah are the 3 biggies. You can see just from their page numbers here, their books are really, really long. And they're the biggies because they live through the destruction of the first temple, each of them in their own way. Isaiah is a very complicated book. We could do a year of study only on the book of Isaiah. It's in the book of Isaiah that we have an actual telling of what is likely the discovery of the book of Deuteronomy. Isaiah himself tells us a story of, oh, I found this book when we were renovating the temple and we found this actual scroll, and it's the story of the book of Deuteronomy. There's a real connection between the book of Isaiah and the text of Deuteronomy itself. And Isaiah himself, Isaiah's lifetime, as it's told in the book, spans a very, 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 very long time, which is why scholars believe that it's a compilation work. We'll leave that aside. And Jeremiah and Ezekiel are the two prophets that actually live in real time through the destruction of the first temple. Jeremiah, and this is what we're going to see in the book of Lamentations, is the prophet who stays. He has an option to leave the city of Jerusalem, but he refuses it. He stays put and he lives through the actual destruction. And so the book, the Megillah that we're going to meet in class, is his telling of what he witnesses, whereas Ezekiel leaves with in the Babylonian exile. If you know the psalm by the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down and wept as we remembered Zion, that's Ezekiel. He travels out and he experiences the destruction with that elite community who has been exiled to Babylon. And then the last prophet, and this is where actually we're just going to get a taste of it in this class, but it's really, we're going to get to know him well in our next series. The last prophet is a much less famous one, Hoshea. Hoshea, really, this is his central metaphor. So we will have a love-hate relationship with him for it. But Hoshea is a really, really, really interesting prophet because in this meeting point between sacred myth and history, Hoshea is one of the examples that there's the least distance between him, the real him, and what we have of him from his book. And so we really get to see what Judaism in the 8th century was like, and what a functioning prophet at the time was like and what he believed. And as it turns out, one of the things that he believed is that he drew heavily on this languaging of, on one hand, the spiritual life is best characterized by a loving relationship. And on the other hand, when things do not go well, use of this really challenging metaphor of adultery and of whoring about. So we're going to get a taste of that in class this week, but then it's going to be a very interesting context for us because, as it turns out, Hoshea lived at a time where he was in active conflict and struggle with goddess-based religion, some of it from within Judaism and some of it outside of Judaism in what we would call ancient Canaanite religion that was side by side. So that is for the next series. For this class, so in preparation, if you'd like to read the My Jewish Learning articles on these 4 prophets, I encourage you to do so: Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Hoshea. And what I want you to take from this warm-up video is that these are each books in their own right in the Tanakh, here in this section that we call prophets, that they have a history of their own, and that unlike the Torah, which is a sacred myth, where really for any of its stories, the question, is this true? Did this happen? Is not a helpful question. It's not the most instructive question to when I wrestle with that question with 8th graders or even with high school students, they're really stuck inside of that question and the feeling of, well, what is its value if it isn't true? And yet for us as a circle of women who really has lived and breathed the complexity of life, we know that the questions, is it true and did it happen, are wildly different questions. And often a direct historical accounting of something that happens is just not the way to convey deep truth. So the Torah is a work of literature whose mission is to convey deep truth about meaning and God and the nature of what it is to live as a human being on the earth plane. When we turn instead to the works of the prophets, what we find, it is very, very likely that these 4 men actually had roles, leadership roles within the community that was biblical Israelite religion. Now, how similar their lives were to the lives of the people who were living at the time that they were, that's a fascinating question outside of our scope. So, for example, they were each literate in sacred tradition. They knew the stories of the Torah. They play with them in their writings, and yet the people they were writing for the most part, were not literate. So there's some really interesting questions there about what did the world look like at the time that they were writing. Now, can I tell you that these four men wrote the totality of their books? That's a matter of serious debate. But for our purposes, that's not important. What's important is that these four books are snapshots into a moment of Jewish history, which we don't normally think about, but yet which is part of the foundational layers of Judaism as we inherit it today. So that is what we are going to get into as we wrestle with the really challenging themes and metaphors that come up in the book of Lamentations. And of course, the fact of Lamentations that it's marking what was the single greatest tragedy in Jewish historical memory prior to the Holocaust. So that is where we are headed. I will see you in class on Monday.